Welcome to the New York State Association of School Business Officials webinar. Today's program is Show Me the Money, Maximizing Your District's State Aid, and is sponsored by Cadani Architects, PC. Your host for today's program is Donna Clement, Director of Professional Development for New York State ASBO. Operator assistance is available at any time during this conference by pressing #. A question and answer session will follow the presentation. You may send chat questions during the presentation using the chat window indicated by speech bubble icon located to the right of the presentation. I will now turn the call over to our host. Donna, please begin.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome everyone to our monthly planner June edition, Show Me the Money, Maximizing Your District State Aid. And this is sponsored by Cadani Architects, and we appreciate that sponsorship. And we certainly appreciate our two speakers today, Sherry Fisher, who's Director of Business and Support Services for Schodack Central Schools, and Lisa Kyer, who's the Business Administrator from Lansingburg Central School District. And they have put together a very complete program for you today. And as always, make sure you ask questions and we will answer them for you. So Lisa and Sherry, it is all yours.
Thank you. We're going to proceed to the first slide. This is Sherry Fisher speaking. Before we begin, we wanted to talk with you a little bit about the format of the presentation. You will notice that there is a very extensive PowerPoint. I think it's about 91 slides. Rest assured, we will not be going through the entire PowerPoint, but we wanted you to have it as a resource document and reference materials that you could look back to. So we did put together some comprehensive information. We'll be concentrating our efforts today on the areas, the expense-driven aids, where you really have more control over what you spend and how much you generate in aid. We're going to spend a little bit of time reviewing special education reporting, reporting for BOCES services, reporting for building aid, transportation aid, and the instructional materials aid. Lisa Kyer is here with me, and we'll be kind of dog and pony going back and forth on the various sections of the presentation. If you have questions, feel free to use the chat room to articulate your questions. We're going to begin on page 3 and just talk a little bit about the state aid process. Without knowing your familiarity with state aid, I think probably the most important thing to understand is that claiming state aid is a fairly complex process, and it takes a while, if you're new at it, to learn it. If you remember anything from today's presentation, you should remember that your ability to claim state aid is really dependent on it being timely, making sure your projections are reliable, and your claim data is accurate. And you need to involve a broad range of staff throughout your district, and you need to be working on state aid pretty actively throughout the school year. It isn't just once a year in the summer. Given the state of the economy and what all school districts are facing with reductions in state aid, it's critically important that we maximize our state aid and that we make sure that all of our claims are filed properly and that we're taking advantage of all the aid that we're entitled to. As we mentioned, this is not necessarily going to cover every single facet of state aid, but it will give you a good sense of the state aid process and the areas that you should be concentrating on and looking at in your school district to make sure that you're receiving all the aid that you're entitled to. Moving on to slide 5, making sure that you have a data collection and reporting process in place in your district is very, very important. You're going to need to involve, depending on the size of your district and depending on who's involved in the clerical end of things, you'll involve a number of different people in the process. And you need to make sure that they understand what they're reporting. Commonly, when you go into school districts and look at their state aid information, often the folks who are reporting it don't have a real good understanding of the state aid claim process, and they don't always know exactly what they're reporting on. So education is a very important part of that process. Before you file your aid claim, you want to make sure that you take a really good look at it and review data trends. If there are any discrepancies, you should research those. If you find any items that are inconsistent with your knowledge of the district, you want to make sure that you take a look at that as well. Just some general reminders for you. You should always re-verify your projection data before the November 1st deadline. The governor's proposal that is released in January and the legislative budget proposals that follow are based on that projection data, so it's very important that it's as accurate as it can be based on what you currently know. You also need to make sure that you're monitoring your state aid output reports throughout the year. Generally, now they've got them on SAMs, and the first output report that you receive is generally somewhere around November, but it's updated 2 or 3 times, sometimes more often during the school year, and your data can change throughout the year, so you want to make sure that you're reviewing and reconciling that information. If you have any aid claims that you need to amend, then you want to make sure that you do that before the end of the school year. There is a 1-year statute of limitations for most aid categories for filing prior year adjustments, but you don't want to put yourself in that situation if you can avoid it. The final note I would make on this as well is be aware of proposals that are out there that can change your state aid. For example, the governor's proposal this year is proposing to cap current year and projected state aid. So the numbers that you are receiving on the governor's proposal for 2009-10, he's proposing to cap at that level. What that would do is prevent you from being able to modify your aid claim in 2009-10, and if you had a data error, if you had something that you hadn't filed, you would lose the opportunity to do that. So it's important that you get things filed on time and that it's accurate the first time around. There have also been proposals advanced to eliminate prior year adjustments, which would not allow you to go back and reclaim should you discover an error or a correction that needs to be made at a later point in time. The first area that we'd like to review with you is aid for special education students. Most of you are probably somewhat familiar with the state aid formulas. They have made changes in the formulas in the past several years. They have folded a number of the special education aid categories into your foundation aid base. The regular formula excess cost aid, declassification, aid due save harmless, and integrated settings are now part of your foundation aid base. Now we all know that our foundation aid base is frozen. So the fact that you're still reporting data for these, it's not generating any additional aid for you. There are several components of the special ed formula that you still can generate additional aid, and that would be high-cost aid for students in high-cost public placements, as well as private excess cost aid, and we're going to talk a little bit about both of those formulas. Moving on to slide 7. The first area, and I'm not going to concentrate a lot of time on slide 7, 8, 9, and 10. These are basically the criteria for reporting the levels of service, and as I mentioned, because it's folded into the foundation aid formula, while it's important and it does drive some pupil counts, it's not as critical in terms of maximizing your state aid as it once was. And I'm going to move right to slide 11. One of the things that I commonly find, I know in my school district, I make a point of meeting with my special ed director multiple times during the school year to review our special education data. The information that goes into your student information system is what's driving the information that's coming out. So if it's not being entered accurately going into the system, then you can expect that the information that you're getting out for state aid reporting is going to reflect that inaccuracy. So it's worth taking the time to sit down with your pupil personnel director or special ed director and their staff and reviewing how the data should be entered, making sure they understand the levels of service, making sure that the information from the IEPs is getting translated to the proper level of service in the student information system, making sure that all of the services on the student's IEP are listed in the system. And we kind of do a reconciliation during the year because sometimes services get added during the year through a meeting and they might not necessarily make it onto the system until a much later point in time. There's also, just so that you are aware, an FTE calculator on the New York State Education Department website that you can use for reporting. The FTE calculation is very simple. It's the number of weeks the student is enrolled in the program divided by the number of weeks that the program is operating. And if you just remember that basic formula, you'll make sure that your FTEs are reported accurately. So if you have a child who enters in the middle of the school year, you should be reporting an FTE of 0.5. And commonly districts make mistakes on that, or they forget to report children who entered in the middle of the year or children who left during the year. They completely miss reporting that FTE. Moving on to the next slide on page 12. This is an area where we often find that districts miss out on state aid in the area of high-cost aid. High-cost aid is available for high-cost students that are educated in school district and BOCES programs. So if you're providing a program in your own school district or you're sending them to BOCES, you should know that there is additional aid available for these students. To generate the aid, you must file STAC forms and you must go through the STAC reporting system. If you do not, you will not generate any aid for those students. The aid is based on when the program cost for the child exceeds 3 times your district's approved operating expense per pupil. And you can find that number directly on your public access cost aid output report. For my district, 3 times our AOE is about $21,000. So I know if we have a child who rises above $21,000, then we should be looking at that child to file a STAC. With BOCES programs, it's a little bit more straightforward. With districts programs, you actually have to go through a process of costing out their program. Another important point for STAC filing is you want to make certain that you are reporting the annualized tuition on the STAC form. What does that mean? What that means is you're reporting the cost of that child's education program as if they were in the program for the entire school year. So again, students who come in mid-year or students who leave mid-year, you're still going to want to report if their annual tuition for the entire school year would be over the threshold of 3 times your approved operating expense per pupil, you're going to want to make sure you file a STAC form for that child. You need to report the direct cost of special education services. Important point, it needs to be on the IEP. If it's not on the IEP as a service that's being delivered to the child, you can't claim it on a STAC form. And that's a common mistake that's made in school districts. If you have a child who has a particularly high program cost, then you would want to report, or you have to report additional information to the state. If the program cost is above basically $85,000 or higher, there's additional STAC information that you have to report to have that placement approved. Moving on to slide 13. What is the process? Initially, you would file a STAC 1. That's the initial approval process, and there is an online STAC system, and at the end of the presentation, we've given you a link to that where you can access information from the STAC unit. If it's a student who is continuing in a placement from one year to the next, you may file a STAC 2, which is really just a reapplication, and you're just really verifying the tuition rates for the upcoming school year and reporting the tuition for the upcoming year. It's important that you have a system in place to know what STACs have been filed and also to verify that you receive the STAC 3 approval back from the state. If you do not receive a STAC 3 approval, then they haven't approved the placement for aid. And if you're not tracking that in the district, then you may not be getting all of the aid on STACs that you filed if they haven't been processed by the state and you haven't gotten an approval back. There are a couple of opportunities throughout the school year where the state will send you information to verify. For students that are in high-cost public and BOCES programs, there is a report called the HISER report, High Cost STAC 3 Amendment Report. You receive it in the year following the child's attendance, because that's when you generate the aid, the year after they attend. And you have the opportunity to verify it and return it. If you do not return it, they will zero out your aid. So it's important that you make sure that you are looking for that document. They don't always send it at the same time. Sometimes it's December, sometimes it's January, sometimes it's February. So you need to be on the lookout for that high-cost STAC 3 amendment report. It usually goes to the superintendent, and then he may send it directly to the pupil personnel director, and you may not receive it in the business office, so you need to be communicating with both your superintendent and your special education director to make sure that that information is received and that it's verified and returned by the deadline. For BOCES programs, you can use your BOCES bill to determine the initial tuition and related service costs. In the year following, BOCES, our local BOCES sends us a printout that identifies the annual cost for all of our students in BOCES programs, and I believe most BOCES are equipped to do that. You also need to establish a reasonable methodology to cost out your in-district placements, and it's surprising how many districts don't even go through the process of looking at their in-district placements and costing them out. And finally, make sure that you're reviewing the output report when it comes out so that all the children you filed stack forms on are actually appearing on your output report. Moving to slide 14. Again, we mentioned reporting the annualized cost on the stack form. What costs do you need to include? You're going to include all costs associated with the direct educational services that are provided to the child. They have to be listed on the IEP. For an in-district program, you're looking at the salary and benefits of special education teachers, and if there is a one-to-one or a classroom aide or a teacher assistant, you would prorate that by the number of children in the classroom. Itinerant services, if the child may be receiving related services, occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, adaptive phys ed, counseling, visually impaired services, services for students that are hard of hearing or deaf, music therapy, psychological services. There's a broad range of services that children can receive. And the challenge for in-district programs is determining a methodology to cost that out, and we'll talk about that in a minute. You would also include, if you, let's say a student needed a particular type of computer or a particular piece of equipment to be able to be supported in the classroom, you would include that in the year that you purchase that equipment on that particular child's stack form. The State Education Department does tend to discourage supplies and materials, operations and maintenance, evaluation costs, so I would not recommend including those. They're more overhead costs, and typically those should not be included because they're not direct services to the child. When you look at costing out your in-district programs, also keep in mind that there are a couple of different methods that you may choose to do that. Larger districts sometimes find it easier to calculate an average teacher salary and an average cost for related services by speech, OT, and come up with a spreadsheet formula. I would recommend that you have a fairly detailed methodology. If you're a small district, you may find it easier to cost out each individual child and each individual classroom, and you may drive more aid by doing it that way. I would have two recommendations for you. One, if you select a methodology, make sure that it's rational and that you can defend it in the event of an audit. And also you want to make sure that you are looking at the services the children are getting, because one method may be more beneficial to you than another method. So you want to take a look at that. And you should also be consistent, like don't swap back and forth your methodologies from one year to the next. When you're looking at BOCES programs, you're going to report the annual cost on the stack form for the tuition and any related services. Now, depending on the BOCES, some BOCES will lump it all into one tuition line, and some BOCES will separate it out and have a different cost for each related services. So you need to know how your BOCES is bundling the tuitions to make sure that you're capturing all of the costs. If you're supplying an aid for that student in the program, you can include that on the stack form. Another thing you want to keep in mind is that there is a deduction for the BOCES refund, and you will get a report at the time when you file your high-cost tax reamendment report from your BOCES that will have deducted the BOCES refund. And the other thing you need to keep in mind is when the initial public excess cost aid report for high cost is mailed to you, it will have individual student names, and you need to make sure that you verify those individual student names and that all the children you have filed stacks for are showing up on that report. The other thing you need to keep in mind is that later on in the year, after the HISA report is filed, your BOCES refund will be reflected, so you can expect in most cases that your high cost aid is going to go down somewhere between March and May when the state processes that high-cost tax reamendment report. So you need to keep that in mind when you're reconciling your revenues for the school year and projecting for the upcoming year. You should also make sure that at some point during the year or several points that you review the roster of special education students served from your student information system, whether it's IEP Direct or ClearTrack or whatever system you're using. You want to make sure that you're taking a look at that and that it reconciles with the head counts that you have for special education. And it should tie fairly closely. If it doesn't, it could signal that there's a problem in your student information system or that information has not been entered correctly. Finally, have some kind of an organized record-keeping system so that you can track back your class lists and aid assignments, equipment purchases for your in-district kids, and also so that you can track the stacks that were filed and your approvals that you've received back. Moving on to slide 15, there are also students that are reported through the STACK system that are in approved private schools. That can be either an in-state or an out-of-state private school. It could be a special act school, or it could be one of the two state-operated schools. Again, the only way you generate aid for these students is if you file a STACK 1 or STACK 2 and you receive the approval back from the state and you verify it in the following year. There is an online verification system in place for private placement, so you can go right online and verify. It's much easier than sending in the manual paper. You should also be aware that the tuition rates are approved by the state once a year. Well, we say once a year, but it takes them sometimes several years to approve a rate. They're established by the rate setting unit within state ed, and the rates tend to lag in terms of the approval. So sometimes when you file the STACK, there might be showing a 0 for the tuition rate. You need to make sure at some point that the tuition is showing up and once the state has approved it. There's also a reconciliation process that takes place in many cases a number of years after the student has been educated. For example, I just received reconciliations for some private students for 4 years that go back as early as 06, 07, and they're just reconciling the rates. I've seen a lot of districts will just pay those bills, and they really are not looking at it and verifying it and making sure that the new rates that have been updated and the bills that they're being asked to be paid by to the private schools, that they're actually verifying that information. And it's important that you do that. You can go on State Ed's website, and you can there is a link where you can look at all the reconciled rates and the new rates, and you can compare it with what you paid initially, and you should have some kind of a system in place to know for your private students, even if it's as simple as a spreadsheet, that you're tracking what you initially paid, what the initial rate was, that you have a record and documentation of the reconciled rate, and that you're not overpaying. So you should have some system in place for that. Don't just take those bills at face value and pay them. For students who are in private schools, they're typically kids who are in our local area, like Parsons or Wildwood or St. Catherine's. You do have to have an annual contract with the private school, and if it's the first time the child is being placed in a private placement, there is a private placement pre-approval data form that needs to be filled out. If you don't have the contract and you don't have that form for an initial placement, you will not generate any aid for that student. So it's important that your special ed director knows that that process needs to be filed. When you have additional expenses, in addition to the tuition in the private school, you do have to have special SED approval to add expenses. Like, let's say you need to supply a one-on-one aid for a child, or they need particular equipment. You need to get special state ed approval to do that. And again, just as a final reminder, make sure that you're reviewing the private excess cost output report and that you submit the online verifications in the following year. Very, very important.
Hi, this is Lisa Kyer. Sherry's going to pick up again, but we had a question that I thought was important to answer for you. Diana Dooley asked, what recourse does a district have when the rate set is lower than what they were billed by the provider school? Just so that you know, rates can go down in these private placements. It's a very long process that they have to go through, and it does take 2 years. So their rates have 2 years with which they can be reconciled. If it does go down, you are entitled to get that money back from that provider. So if you're tracking it properly, then you would invoice that provider, and they are required to pay you back for that difference. State Ed will automatically make an adjustment to your private excess cost aid. So you may see an adjustment come through on a prior year where they're going to take something back because of that rate being reduced. But you want to make sure that you are billing back that private provider to get that money back. I'll give it back to Sherry Fisher.
Thank you, Lisa. Lisa's keeping track of the questions while I'm speaking. Very good question, and it does happen. So make sure you have a system in place so that you know how to properly invoice. Moving on to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about summer school special ed. Students who are educated in July and August are referred to in the statute as Section 4408 students. And there is a separate category of aid available for these students that are in, and it doesn't matter what kind of program they're in. They could be in a district program, they could be in a neighboring district, they could be at BOCES, they could be at an approved private placement for the summer, but it's for children who require 12-month educational services. And there's a separate stack form that you must file for these summer special ed students. You file a stack for the 10-month year, and then you would file a second one if the student is receiving services in July and August. And on the stack form, you are eligible for reimbursement of the tuition, the maintenance if it's a residential placement, and also the transportation costs. And you want to make sure, particularly with the transportation costs, that you have a methodology to cost them out so that you can arrive at a cost per child. What I do is put together a spreadsheet that shows the school bus driver's salary and benefits, the salary and benefits of the school bus attendant that's on the bus. If there are 5 children on the bus, and you're basically taking their salary and benefits divided by the 5 children that are riding on the bus to arrive at a cost per pupil that you can easily document through your ST3. So make sure that you keep a detailed spreadsheet of your transportation costs and make sure that you report them. State Ed, if your transportation costs look out of line, they will audit it and they will question it. That is one area that they're fairly sensitive to, so make sure that you can support what you claim. And again, you have to file a stack form every year to generate the aid. The online verification system is how you would verify in the following year. The State Ed, they reimburse 80% of the approved costs under current law. And that says under current law because under the governor's proposal, he is proposing to reduce that from 80% to your state sharing ratio. If you need to know what that number is, you can look on your general aid output report. Look for your final foundation aid state sharing ratio, and that will tell you how your level of reimbursement would drop under that proposal. And I don't know if that will be enacted. There certainly has been some opposition to it, but that is certainly a possibility. All of the expenses for your summer special ed do need to be reported in the special aid fund, and so you need to make sure that you're tracking it and recording it, not in the general fund, but in the special aid fund, and that would include the tuition, the transportation, and any expenses associated with the summer special ed population. That's another common error. We're not going to go through slides 18 and 19, but we did just want to provide you with some information. There are a number of other placements that are reported through the STACK system, and the financial responsibility and the reporting responsibility will vary depending on the type of placement, but we wanted just to give you a reference guide so you knew where to look if you have that particular type of placement. Now I'm going to turn the speaker over to Lisa Kyer, and she's going to review BOCES Aid.
Thank you, Sherry. You may be a little confused with our slide numbering, and we apologize. Your slides have one more number than ours too, so every now and then we will get a little confused and use our number, but just know add one and it's the one that you're looking at. I'm going to talk a little bit about BOCES all BOCES Aid. Generally, there's 3 types of BOCES Aid that you will get. They're all lumped into one, but it's based on 3 components. You have your BOCES Administrative Aid, your BOCES Facilities Aid, and your BOCES Shared Services Aid. With the Facilities Aid, it's based on current year expenditures. So this is an area that gets a little bit confusing because it is based on current expenditures. It's harder to estimate. It is debt service payments on debt instruments issued by BOCES for construction. It also includes any budgetary appropriations or capital reserves that they use for their construction, as well as any lease of BOCES facilities. For Facilities Aid, you use your current year RWA to aid ratio, and there's no minimum and a maximum of 90%. So very wealthy districts will not get any BOCES Facilities Aid. They could have a aid ratio that is 0. If you want to look at how to compute this, look at your BOCES Aid output report that you can pull off the state website. Entry 1 will give you your RWA to aid ratio for the current year, and entries 5 and 6 break down the rental costs and the construction costs. They also give you both the actual 09-10 and the estimated 10-11, so you'll be able to use that for the current year and for estimating going forward. This is an area we think causes sometimes the projections to be off, and it's very often not correct on the initial output report that you received from state ed. I looked at mine early this year, and there was a number on there. 2 weeks later, I got another BOCES Aid output report. It was zeroed out. Then it came back. And I think at this point it's correct, but it's something you do have to watch and track because it is the hardest one for them to get, both for BOCES to estimate it and for the state to report it correctly. Going on to the next slide. We'll talk about BOCES Shared Services Aid. The Shared Services Aid is the bulk of the aid that you'll get for your BOCES. This is based on your base year expenditure. So this is easier to estimate for both BOCES and for you. And we do recommend that you do your own projections for BOCES because what's on the output reports is always overstated. Remember, when you're calculating what you believe your BOCES aid to be, any special ed services or transportation services are not going to be BOCES aidable. So make sure you back those all out. Special ed is aided through the excess cost and transportation through transportation. So they will not go through BOCES aid. Some of the areas that are reimbursed would include your career education, itinerant services, general instruction, instructional support, and other miscellaneous services as approved by the commissioner. The BOCES actually has to go to the commissioner, submit a COSA request to determine if a service that they want to provide will be aidable. So new services are added all the time. For BOCES Shared Services Aid, you will use your RWA to aid ratio or your millage aid ratio, depending on whichever is higher. The minimum there is 36% and the maximum is 90%. So every district is going to get a little bit of the Shared Services Aid. To find this on your output report, you want to look at entries 1 for the aid ratio for RWADA, 5 for the millage aid ratio, and entry 8 will show you your selected aid ratio, the one that they're using for this piece. And then if you look at your output report, it goes through each of the different areas. Your administrative, it breaks it down by expenditure area so that you can see not only what has been reported as an expense for you, but also what's been deducted. Because remember, there's areas that, like excess salaries over $30,000 are going to be backed out, things you can't estimate, but they are on your output reports. And you want to be able to compare what's on your BOCES bill to what's on the output report so that you can see if things are lining up for you. Continuing with Shared Services Aid, there's some other areas that districts don't always know they can receive aid on, and we've tried to list a few. Security cameras, purchase and monitoring can be aidable. We receive aid on this through NARIC. We're actually a member of the Questar 3 BOCES, but we do a cross-contract with NARIC, and we get aid for our security cameras and our monitoring. Door alarms, phone systems, purchase and maintenance, network printers. So your copiers, if there's network printers, could be aidable if they have an approved COSER. Computers, obviously, GASB 45, asset management, appraisals, energy management, cooperative bids, point-of-sale systems, staff development. There's all kinds of different things that can be aidable through BOCES. If there's something that you would like BOCES to be doing and you don't see that they're doing it, check and see if there's a cross-contract for another BOCES to provide that service. And if that's not available, then ask your BOCES if there's other districts interested, and they could start something new if it's something that more districts would want, and that then could become an aidable service. One of the common areas that we see is federal monies being used to purchase BOCES services. And sometimes you just have to. That's how it's set up, and that's what needs to be done. But just remember, if you're using federal funds to purchase a BOCES service, you have to back those out at the end of the year. So BOCES will send you a letter, as happens with ours, and each BOCES is a little different. But we receive a letter that says, what services, COSER number, account code, etc., were purchased through federal codes. And that is backed out of your BOCES aid. If it's not, then you're double dipping. So you want to be very careful, and you would lose that on an audit. But if it's backed out, obviously you won't get the aid on that. So you also want to be careful when you're estimating that you're not including federal expenses in the expenses that you're using for estimating. And if at all possible, don't use federal funds for BOCES services. Use your federal funds, and then use your general fund for BOCES services that will be aidable to maximize your aid. The next slide goes into projecting BOCES aid. And again, I've said this before, the governor's and the legislative proposals historically run very high on BOCES aid. So I always recommend to my superintendent and my school board, we never use the number that's on that report. So what we do is we calculate our own BOCES aid. And it's pretty simple to do using your BOCES bill. You're going to use your you can use your current year output report, take your BOCES bill, and plug in the updated numbers. Remember, don't calculate aid for transportation or special ed. Those are aided elsewhere, so you do not want those included in your estimate. Talk to your BOCES. Find out if anything you're purchasing is not going to be allowable for aid. Sometimes they will have a COSER that is not aidable, so make sure you back those out. And if you go through that output report and you look at all of your deductions as a total, add those up, take a percentage of that to your allowable expenditures, you'll come up with a ratio of what is allowable and aidable based on those allowable expenditures. And you want to apply that aid ratio to the expenditure amount you come up with before you apply your BOCES aid ratio. So there's a couple of steps that you need to go through. And then remember, use the proper aid ratio. For facilities, it's current year expenses, and it's the RWADA. And for services and administration, it's base year expenditures, and it's the higher of the RWADA or the millage. Moving on to building aid. The most important thing with building aid is obtain the proper SED approvals. Believe it or not, we have been in districts where they did a roofing project and they said, okay, this was an emergency, we had to do it. They didn't go through the proper process. They didn't get a building permit. They didn't get their plans and specs approved, and none of it is aidable. So even if it's an emergency, talk to your project manager. They'll let you do a quick repair under emergency, and it may still be aidable, but the entire roof is not going to be without going through the approval process. Ensure that you're not exceeding your debt limit. If you exceed your debt limit and you don't have a supermajority vote to do so, then you've got a problem, and you won't be able to get aid on that. If anyone challenges it, it's not going to be approved. And make sure you obtain proper voter approvals. Whether you're going out with a separate proposition or it's a transfer to the capital fund through your general budget, you have to get that voter approved. Then once you have a voter-approved project, you have approval of plans and specs, there are certain ways that you can track your expenditures. The FPF is the form that the architect is going to submit with the approval of plans and specs to the State Education Department and Facilities Planning. They're going to estimate the cost by building and by alteration versus addition of the project that you intend to proceed with. Once that's done, you're going to get all your approvals from state ed. You're going to go out and you're going to bid your project. Then you're going to say to the contractors, okay, I need from you a schedule of values. The schedule of values is the contractor's breakdown of what the actual cost is going to be. They may not spend a lot of time putting that schedule of value together. They want to get to construction. They don't spend a lot of time doing this, and it's extremely important that this is correct. So you want to look at that closely, compare it to your FPFs. If it's way off, you want to find out why. Talk to your architect, talk to your construction managers if you have one, your contractors, and say, okay, did you really break this out appropriately? Is it split correctly between buildings? Is it split correctly between alterations and additions? Because remember, SED is going to start paying you based on an FPF. Now you're going to have to fill out an SA-139. When you fill out the SA-139, you're going to use the schedule of values to do that, because that's telling you how to break it out by building and by contractor. So you're going to have to go and fill out this SA-139. You want to make sure that the expenditures are in the appropriate area. Look for major variances. Make sure the contractor split the costs appropriately. Determine what the maximum cost allowance is set by SED, and see if you're exceeding it from the get-go. If you are, maybe it's time to move some expenditures around before you get started. Moving on to the next slide. Your SA-139 is what's going to trigger your building aid. Aid is paid 18 months after the commissioner's approval date or certification to SED that a general contract has been signed. That's generally done with your SA-139. That whichever is later is going to trigger it. So that when the SA-139 is submitted, it's going to determine if you get a full year aid or a half year's worth of aid in the first year. So submitting that before a certain date is going to say, okay, you're now entitled to a full year aid. If you submit it after that date, it's going to be a half year aid. So you want to talk to your fiscal advisors about that as well. But it's always key to get that SA-139 in as soon as you possibly can so that aid can start flowing to you. Aid is going to be based on an assumed amortization set by SED. So once your SA-139s are in, you can go to the state aid output report page and you can get what the assumed amortizations are going to be. You may not borrow at that same rate. If you go out to just the open market, you're not guaranteed that the rate you're getting won't be higher than what the assumed amortization is that SED is paying you on. So you want to know what that difference is, because that makes a difference in your aid. If you decide to go through DASNY, you are guaranteed whatever rate DASNY gives you will be the same rate that the state will use for your assumed amortization. But it is a little bit more difficult and a little bit more costly to go through DASNY. But in this market, it may be something that is possible for you to do and appropriate. So you want to talk to your fiscal advisors about that. As your project progresses, you want to monitor your expenses very closely. Make sure you're not exceeding those maximum cost allowances. Make sure things look appropriate. Look at your additions versus renovations. Are you still in line with what you told SED would be happening? Especially as you get change orders. Are things still lining up? You can do an FPFI to amend the allocation of your expenditures as the process proceeds. So you want to make sure you do that as you go through the process. Track change orders. Some districts now just go with an allowance, and it's easier that way. You have a certain allowance that the contractors are allowed to go up to. Others still use the change order process. We do here use the change order process. I think I had 187 on the last final cost report that I did. It's difficult to track, but it's very, very important that you are tracking those change orders. You're making sure they get into SED with the appropriate project number on them. They're accounting to the correct building, and they're getting approved by SED. You're not going to get aid if those change orders are not being done properly. Monitor your incidental expenses to make sure they don't exceed the allowance. There's only a certain percentage you're allowed for incidental. So make sure that you're not exceeding that, and make sure they're allowable expenditures. And there's a multi-page document that SED puts out walking you through this process. But generally what I find is easiest to do is to be best friends with my project manager. We talk continually, and we say, well, look, this is happening or that's happening, and he walks us through the best way to do it to make sure that what we're doing is allowable. Determine if your furniture and equipment expenditures are aidable. Certain things are rateable, certain are not. 1 computer in a classroom, okay. 10 computers in a classroom, not so okay. So you want to talk to them about what's allowed to be done and make sure that you're not exceeding that. One last note is don't sign your certificate of substantial completions too soon. Sometimes you need to do those to get your project approved and get your kids in the building. Other times, if it's not a project that you need that certificate of occupation for, you can wait a little bit longer. When your final cost report is due is based on when you submit that certificate of substantial completion. So let's say you're doing a project, you've just finished a project, and you completed the certificate of substantial completion and filed it in 2009. Your final cost report will then be due June 30th of 2011. So you've got, about a 2-year process for that. But if it's a project that you have additional work going on, yes, they did a certificate, but there's some other things going on after the fact. You've got an amendment that you're doing or something else. Hold off on that as long as you can. If they finish in December, don't file it until January. That gives you a whole other year that you can get that final cost report done. You can always do the final cost report sooner, but you want to give yourself enough time to get that done correctly and not rush through that process. And when you do your final cost report, watch your wording carefully. As you're putting things in, don't say, we repaired the sidewalk. It's a renovation. If they see repair, they're going to cross it out and they're going to say it's not aidable. So just watch your wording because they will go through that final cost report and they will disallow things. So you want to make sure that you give yourself the best chance of getting everything that's on there allowed. Be sure your final expenditures are in line with your maximum cost allowance. You want to know that before those final cost reports go in. You don't want state aid coming back to you and saying, well, you exceeded by $1 million, you're going to lose that in aid. You want to know it before it goes in and make sure that those expenditures are allocated appropriately. Make sure you file your FPFI so that you get your costs realigned so they don't come back and say, oh, well, it doesn't match up with what you originally submitted. You can always change those early estimates. Make sure you do that. And most important, don't miss the deadline for your final cost report. If you miss the deadline, you won't get aid on that project. So they will take it back retroactively. So you want to make sure that you get that deadline met. The state education department will send out a list of when they believe, the districts that they believe are due final cost reports by June 30th. Don't always go by that. If you know you have one due and you're not on the list, get that done. Don't rely on state ed because you could submit it late and they could say, well, just because we weren't on our list doesn't mean it wasn't due. Okay. We're moving on to transportation aid, and I'm going to turn it back over to Sherry, who will walk you through this.
Thank you, Lisa. Another area that often districts struggle with in reporting is transportation aid. And transportation aid is largely driven or essentially driven by the data that you report on the ST3 as well as what you report on Form FT, which is basically where you're reporting your transportation data. In terms of eligible transportation, there are a couple of slides 31 and 32, that go through the types of transportation that's eligible. I mean, basically your regularly scheduled routes, your transportation to and from BOCES, if you have shuttle transportation either to an OCAD center or to another academic program within the district, to and from daycare centers. There can also be transportation to preschools in some cases, and transportation of homeless pupils would be eligible for aid as well. And how you report them is you're reporting the mileage, so make sure that the mileage that you're reporting is accurately reflected, as well as the expenses. Also, your students who go to outside special education placements, either at BOCES or private schools, transportation for non-public schools and charter schools is eligible for aid. Transportation for students with disabilities goes up to 50 miles, and if there is not an appropriate option within 50 miles, you can get approval from the commissioner to transport beyond 50 miles. And also, students can be transported from home to a residential school 3 times a year, plus the beginning of the school year and end of the school year trip. So just be aware of the types of transportation that is eligible for aid. And then there are a few others, including in-district summer school programs. Remember that special ed summer school programs are going to be aided in transportation through the STAC system, so you don't want to report any mileage associated with summer special ed on your transportation aid claim. Moving on to slide 34, just a couple of notes on mileage. This is an area when I first began working with our transportation supervisor, I found that I actually had to sit down with our transportation supervisor and head bus driver in earlier years to review the mileage because they really didn't understand the reporting, and they were the mileage numbers that I was getting were very inconsistent, and so I did sit down with them once a year to review mileage to make sure that the mileage I was getting for state aid reporting was accurate. And it's important that you do that and that you also maintain some documentation in the files. Your mileage should balance the odometer readings. When you take your regular mileage that you're reporting and all of your other purpose mileage, it should reconcile to your odometer readings, and if it doesn't, then you probably have a problem somewhere where something is not being properly reported. There are specific entries on Form FT that you report mileage, entries 111 through 115, and again, make sure that you verify the accuracy. There are entries that you need to report other purpose mileage. Other purpose mileage is basically mileage other than your regularly scheduled route, so it's things like field trips and sports trips, your regular summer school programs, and mileage for staff or administrative use of vehicle. If you allow your staff to take your school bus vehicles to conferences and other things, then you need to record that in your other purpose mileage. And with the exception of summer school, other purpose mileage is not eligible for transportation aid, and the number that you report under other purpose mileage is used to calculate a deduction to your transportation aid. So if it's not correct, it's going to have the impact of lowering your aidable expenses through the deduction for other purpose mileage. So you want to make sure that you're verifying it, that you can tie it out, again, with the odometer readings. And I found this was an area that my transportation supervisor really needed some help and some guidance on reporting. And, if you just sit down with them and review it and make sure that it's accurate before it goes in, you can make sure that you're minimizing the deductions that you receive under the transportation aid formula. Moving on to slide 36. There is another deduction in the formulas for non-allowable pupils. There is a worksheet that school districts are required to complete at least every 3 years, and you'll get a letter in early spring, usually in March, from the State Education Department saying you're due to file your non-allowable pupil decimal worksheet, and you have to select a day in March, April, or May where you actually record every single transportation route and report the number of students that are allowable versus non-allowable. I would recommend that you take a look at the date that you select. Make sure it's a normal transportation day, that there's not anything unusual going on, because sometimes if you pick a day that's not a normal transportation day, it's going to throw off your non-allowable pupil worksheet and the decimal and the deduction that you receive for transportation aid. Moving on to slide 37, they use the non-allowable pupil decimal to calculate a deduction in capital, operating, contractual, and public service expenses. And they define an allowable pupil as a student who resides 1.5 miles or greater from the school that they attend. And students with disabilities are generally considered allowable if transportation is listed on their IEP. So if you have any special ed students, generally they're going to be allowable pupils even if they're less than 1.5 miles, provided that it's on their IEP. One of the things that you want to be conscious of when designing your routes is to make sure that you have at least one or more allowable pupils on your bus routes, because it really has the effect of minimizing the deduction that you get for the non-allowable pupil decimal. Can you go back that one? Thank you, Lisa. The deduction for the non-allowable pupil decimal is calculated based on the number of non-allowable pupils that you have. So the higher the non-allowable pupils, the lower that your decimal will be. So you want to make sure, the higher it will be. So you want to make sure that you minimize the number of non-allowables and you maximize the number of allowables so that you can have the lowest decimal as possible for calculating the deduction. Next slide, please. In terms of eligible transportation expenses, most of this information is driven directly from your ST3, and there are a number of supplemental schedules that you file for transportation. You want to include the salary and benefits of your drivers, mechanics, school bus attendants. One common error that I've seen with bus attendants, you can only count them if they're serving special ed students, and some districts erroneously report them in the account code 2250 because they're tied to the special education program. And you want to make sure that all of your special education bus attendants or bus aides are recorded in the 5510 ST3 code. Otherwise, they won't be generating aid for you. So make sure that's the case. For transportation supervisor, you can report their expenses as well if you have a staff person who's performing the transportation supervisor function. As long as it's not an assistant superintendent or the superintendent, you can report a portion of their salary. Dispatcher, if you have clerical support, that's supporting the transportation office and any other personnel that are directly involved in transportation. State Ed has gotten a little bit tighter in terms of the clerical, and just make sure that when you report for the clerical personnel that you're careful that you can document it. And they tend to discourage reporting like a portion of payroll and accounts payable and other things, although I have seen some districts use those calculations in reporting. Moving on to the next slide, other expenses. Anyone who's involved in transportation less time, just prorate their salary and benefits. Make sure that it's showing up in the transportation portion of the ST3. If you're using an outside consultant, you can report those expenses as well. And again, all of your salary codes have to be in either 5510 or 5530, which are the payroll codes for transportation, in order to generate any aid. For moving on to page 40, for transportation, you can also claim the benefits. A couple of important points here. They can only be the benefits of your active transportation employees, and you can only report the health and dental insurance for an individual premium. So if you have a bus driver that has a family premium, you can only report the portion for the actual transportation employee. Make sure that you have a methodology for proration. You will report those expenses on Form FT, entries 117 and 118. And pretty much all of your standard employee benefits can be claimed for transportation aid. Moving to the next slide. Here's a schedule that just tells you where to report certain expenses, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the items that are eligible. Your contractual expenses are reported on Schedule I. Equipment is reported on Schedule G for your in-district program and Schedule L for the Transportation Supervisor's Office. Keep in mind that the aid on equipment and transportation is amortized over 5 years, so it's going to take you 5 years to get your aid back on any equipment purchases through transportation. Supplies and materials are reported on Form FT, and your public or FT Schedule H, and your public service carrier expenses on Schedule K. So you want to make sure that you complete those schedules carefully, that you provide as much detail as possible. State Ed tends to not like when you put miscellaneous categories in there. If you put miscellaneous and you don't identify the expense, they will, in a desk audit, often call and say, break it out in a further level of detail. Make sure when you look at your insurance policies that you're prorating for your auto fleet and the bus garage. You can include liability. You can include, property damage, all of your standard auto insurances. Umbrella liability, you can prorate for the transportation-related exposure. And I request a letter every year from my insurance agent that tells me the portion of my umbrella that's due to transportation. For our district, it usually hovers anywhere between 80 and 82%. So a good portion of the umbrella liability is attributed to transportation, and you want to make sure that you are coding it to the transportation codes in order to generate aid. There are also expenses associated with the bus garage that you can claim as well. And utilities, again, make sure that you're prorating all of your utilities for heat, electric, telephone, snow removal, that all those expenses get reflected in the transportation codes. If they're showing up in your facilities codes, make sure you have a mechanism to make sure that they get transferred over into through a budget transfer before the end of the school year into transportation. We've also listed on page 44 a number of other expenses that are eligible for transportation aid. And there also is a reference guide on State Ed's website that goes into fairly good detail on transportation that you, if you haven't had the opportunity to review, you may want to do so. Lastly, for contracts, if you are involved in, there's been a lot of emphasis at the state level in shared transportation services. We're working on an initiative in our county to try to share transportation services. And if you hire a consultant to assist you with that process, those consulting fees can be aidable if you can demonstrate that they will improve either your efficiency or safety, or that they're economical. So keep that in mind if you're considering hiring a consultant. Supplies and materials, again, it's important that you make sure that you reflect them all on your ST3. This is an area in projections that districts sometimes will overproject, and then their transportation aid will come in lower. So be careful about what you put on the projection column of the ST3. And if there's something you have that you don't know if it's aidable, call the state. Karen Corbin is the individual who handles transportation at the state. Just a quick note on bus purchases. Make sure that you have voter approval. Make sure that you file the SA-16th. Every bus that you buy, you have to have approval from the state. Make sure you get the approval letter back from the state. And if you are doing trade-ins, you can only claim the cost less the trade-ins. So just keep that in mind when you're evaluating trade-ins versus selling them through a surplus bid. In terms of the aid, we've provided on page 48 some information on how the aid is calculated for bus purchases. Just a note on Schedule F6, it's a schedule that is a non-flexible deadline that you have to report to the state by September 1. If you don't have the rest of your aid claim in, make sure you have that schedule in. And on entries 1, 64, and 65, make sure that you're reporting the bus purchases accurately. And I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, and she's going to talk with you a little bit about contract transportation.
Thanks again, Sherry. We have probably another 10 minutes that we'll go through some of the information on our handout, and then we're going to open it up to questions and answers. I'm going to continue now with contract transportation. Very important, if you are a contract transporter, that you get those contracts filed on time. They must be signed before the first date of service. So before that first student is transported, get that contract signed, get it into SED. You still have to do a non-allowable pupil mile every 3 years, just as every other school district does. You want to get that data from your contractor. So when you get the letter from the state, send it off to your contractor, send him the forms, give him the explanation of what he's supposed to be giving you so that you get the data back correctly. And all the same things that Sherry said before apply. The thing that you need to remember with allowable pupils, once you have one allowable pupil on that bus, you multiply the number of allowable, or the number of students on the bus by 1.5 for non-allowable, number of non-allowables by 1.5. When you have no allowable students on the bus, you have to multiply the number of non-allowables by the total number of miles that bus travels. So just getting that one student on there really helps you. So make sure your contractor knows that as well and work with them on the routing to make sure that that happens. You also can claim your appropriate salaries and individual benefits, not your family benefits. We have contract transportation here at Lansingburg. My treasurer is my transportation supervisor, so part of his salary is coded to the 5510, 5540, so that we can claim that, as well as part of mine. I'm not an assistant superintendent, so I can still claim part of my salary. Secretarial, if we had anything like that, we could do that as well. Still prorate your utilities. You don't have a bus garage, but you have a transportation office. So again, ours is very minimal because it's a part-time person that does it in one room, but we can still prorate those utilities. We can still prorate the insurance. It won't be as high as the 80% because we don't own our own buses, but there's still a percentage that we'll be able to claim. and make sure you file on Schedule J those transportation contracts. You want to make sure you file that and that you get those approvals back from the State Education Department to ensure that your aid will continue. You also want to make sure that you get all contracts approved. Sometimes you may want to transport with a different company because your current contractor can't do a particular route. So you want to make sure and go through the proper process to get that contract approved and into state ed so that it will be aidable. Be aware of the deductions that are in play for transportation aid. There's not always a lot you can do about them, but to know that they're there will help you to estimate what your aid is. Be sure that Form FT and the ST3 reporting is accurate so that you minimize those deductions and you'll maximize your aid. So you want to print out all your 55 codes, and when you're filling out your Form FT, make sure everything's going in there appropriately and make sure you've done your journal entry transfers into those codes so that those are done correctly. And of course, the fewer deductions, the higher your aid will be. Here's just a list of some specific deductions in the transportation aid formula. We won't go through all of them, but they're here for you to review. And moving on to attendance and enrollment. Okay. Sorry, we're reading a little note on our thing. Moving on to attendance and enrollment, as Sherry said, foundation aid is frozen at the 2008-9 level. So the pupil counts really aren't that important at this point, but they will be again. So you want to make sure that they're accurate. You want to make sure that you know what you're looking for, so in the future you're still having the correct amount of your pupil counts in there. And again, they still must be reported because they are being used for other formulas and for your wealth ratios. You want to verify your district attendance reports. You'll get those at the end of the year from one person probably in your school district. If they don't look right, go back and see if the system printed it out correctly. We have been known to not get them correctly. We worked at one school district where they only got semester 1, they didn't get semester 2, and we had to go back and recreate it because they were using BOCES for their attendance, and the system was turned over. They didn't have the old data in the system. So you don't want that to happen. You want to make sure at the end of the year those reports are out and that they're accurate so you don't have that problem. You want to check your beds data and make sure that that's correct and that's being brought over correctly. Make sure you hit your 180 days. That's very important. When you file that report, if you're less than 180 days, you will have an aid deduct, and it's a simple one that you don't want to lose out on. We're sure we have 180 days. Let's make sure we report it correctly. Review the fall beds data for your K-12 students, your BOCES, your private special ed, your free and reduced lunch. The free and reduced lunch data is based on eligible applicants. So you want to make sure that every student that's eligible is filing a form. This is something that here at Lansingburg we spend a tremendous amount of time on. We probably spend at least 6 weeks at the beginning of the school year making sure every student that's eligible, or almost every student that's eligible, has an opportunity to file that form. Because we're a district that's very high poverty, very high need. And we're more than 50%, so we receive a lot of federal assistance because of that. So if it's not something that means a lot to you, you want to know that you still need a system and process to increase that. The more you have, the more aid you'll get through different categories. But if you're in our situation, it's something that you need to spend a tremendous amount of time on. Okay. Moving on to instructional materials aid. There's 3 different kinds of instructional material aid that you will receive. There's textbook aid, software aid, and library materials aid. The aid for these will be capped at the prior year's actual expenditure or the calculated amount. So you want to go to your output reports and pull up your instructional materials aid output report and see what your maximum is. Make sure you spend up to or beyond that maximum so that you will receive all of the aid. Remember, what you're spending this year is what you'll get aided on for next year. So you're looking at your projected textbook, software, and library to make sure you spend that amount. Don't look at the current year. At this point, they're probably pretty similar, but you want to know that little discrepancy so that you can check that. And for these aids, Aid is final as of April 30th of the aid year. So any ST3 amendments that need to be made by April 30th. We used to have more time to do this, but we don't at this point. So you need to go back. Remember, it's still based on the prior year expense. So you're looking at 08-09 expenses for your 9-10 aid, and you want to be looking at that early enough so you make sure you don't hit that April 30th deadline. A couple things on textbook aid. We won't go through this whole thing, but textbook aid uses a little bit different pupil count than your software and your library aid. So you want to look at that. Make sure you include things like your charter school students in this count. A very important thing in textbook aid is that your 2250 code is not aidable. So if you're purchasing textbooks out of 2250, move that expense to one of these other areas, your 2110, your 2280, or your 2330. We've changed it here at Lansingburg. Everything's purchased out of the 2110 so that we ensure we're getting the maximum amount of textbook aid that we're due. We've given you some descriptions of eligible textbook expenditures, and you can go through these on your own. Ineligible textbook expenditures, teachers' additions, testing material, etc. School agendas, that's a big one. People, I think, sometimes put school agendas in their textbook code that's not eligible for aid. They are not going to know that that's in there, but if you get it audited, it will be pulled out. Library materials aid is a little simpler. There's just one code that you're going to use for your library materials aid. Slide 60 goes through the eligible expenditure or the eligible expenses that are allowable for library aid. Software aid is the same, is one code, and we've gone through the eligible software expenditures. And we also have computer hardware aid. The computer hardware aid, 26322, it is an equipment line, so you don't want to be transferring in and out of that unless you're going from another equipment line, so you want to watch that. You want to make sure that you're appropriately with all of these aids doing the loan program correctly, because you do need to loan these to private schools within your school district. So you want to go through the state's manual on the appropriate way that you should be allocating expenses for your instructional materials aid. And the next couple slides will go through your eligible hardware expenses. We've tried to be as inclusive as possible, but obviously we don't have everything here. So if there's things that you're not sure about, always call State Ed. Slide 68 goes through some ineligible computer hardware expenses. Then we talk a little bit about preparing your state aid claim. Who do you need to involve? You need to know in your district who's the most important person that you need to get the information from. Who are you going to get their non-resident pupil counts from? Who's going to get you your private pupil counts? Who's going to help you with your FTEs for your special needs? Determine who those people are early on and start bugging them for the data early on. What we do here is we copy the prior year's Form A and Form F. We'll do that probably the middle to end of May. That then goes out to the appropriate people with an indication of which fields need to be completed and a date that they need to have that back to this office by. They never hit that date. They're usually pretty good, but they never hit that date. We have to start bugging them, so I make that date early. You have to get that a couple weeks before they're leaving for the summer, because some of these people are not going to be here when you need them. So set up a system, make sure you get the data that you need so that you can get everything into your Form A and F so you can get those submitted to State Ed as soon as possible. Okay. So, we've gone through that. We're going to just skip ahead a little bit. Yes. Okay. We're going to skip ahead to state aid projections. Again, it's very important for you to be estimating what your own aid will be for the following year. A lot of districts sometimes their superintendent requires it, sometimes their board requires them to use the printout that comes out from the governor's office. Remember, that data is projected so early that it's always inaccurate. Sometimes it may be pretty close, but overall it's not going to be great data to use. So if you have a system where you're determining what your own aid will be for the upcoming school year, you're going to be a lot better off. Make sure you're looking at that data prior to November 1st. I know Sherry mentioned this earlier, but it's extremely important that you've reviewed that at least one time before that date. Once they set that drop dead date, that's the number that will be used for the governor's proposal. And a lot of the proposals in the last few years have proposed that they're going to freeze it as of the governor's proposal. So you want to make sure the data is as accurate as possible for that run. Now that we've got a late budget, they tend to update that database again. It's not a guarantee, but in the past, State Ed has always tried to do a little bit later database to get the legislature some better data. There's no guarantee they'll do that, but always keep checking your data for that so that you can get the best data to them by the time the budget is passed and we have our final aid run. Hang on. We're going to turn it over to Sherry, and she's going to finish up. Thank you.
Thanks again, Lisa. The last few slides are really for you to kind of look at your own reference. We tried to put together for you information on the reporting process, just so you're familiar with the forms that you have to file. Form A, Form FT, Form FB, the ST3 are all part of the SAM system. And don't forget, this year and next year are wonderful error reporting through the applications and the quarterly reports that you need to file for your fiscal stabilization aid. The reporting timelines are also shown. We tried to identify the major drop-dead timelines throughout the school year from September right through June so that you identify all those important timelines and things that you should be looking at throughout the school calendar. We're going to skip through the rest of those reporting timelines. And the last section is really devoted to getting it right the first time. And I think we've said this a few times. The way they're computing the state aid formulas and capping at projections and possibility of limiting prior year adjustment in various proposals, you want to make sure that you are starting your data collection reporting process early so that you are getting your data when you need it and that you're not scrambling and rushing around and sending your data in on an incomplete basis. It can be very costly if you have aid claim errors, and the opportunities for amending are just growing slimmer and slimmer. So you want to make sure that you get it right the first time. So we've identified for you a number of different things that you may want to consider in filing your aid claim. On page 85, there's a recap of the payment schedule. You should be taking a look at that, not only to project your cash flow needs and your borrowing needs, but also to make sure that it reconciles with what you're anticipating to receive for the fiscal year. Lastly, we've included a couple of sections on billing for parentally placed students because there's a new process that was instituted, I think, 2 years ago for billing for parentally placed students, and there's some tips there for you as well as if you happen to be in a district that has a lot of charter school students, there's some recommended verifications that you're going to want to do for your charter school students. And finally, we identified a number of areas that you might choose to maximize revenues or minimize expenses. If you're not already looking at that, make sure that you're evaluating your Medicaid program, Medicare Part D, E-rates available, NYSERDA grants. You have a good system in place for managing your state, federal, and private grants, that you're reporting your federal stimulus funding accurately. There's been such huge attention focused on the federal stimulus funds. We want to make sure that we get that right. And if you have major assessment adjustments, I'm dealing with that in the school district that I work for, you want to make sure that you file those reports to have your full value adjusted. Other areas to consider and take a look at in terms of the expense side, the billing for non-resident tuition students, verifying your foster care students. Important one, verifying health service bills. We had a discussion about this at our last business officials meeting, and it seems all over the map in terms of how health So make sure you get good documentation when you get a bill for health services. If you don't, request it. And again, keep your eyes open for shared opportunities, either with other districts, with BOCES, or even with municipalities, and we're seeing that trend is growing phenomenally. And finally, if you don't have an educational foundation, consider creating one. The last two slides are devoted to providing some web links for you where you can get additional information on most of the topics that we covered today. And certainly you can always contact us if you have specific questions. We'd like to open up for any individual questions that you may have before we close out the presentation. So feel free to use the chat room.
Okay, thank you, Lisa and Sherry. And Michelle, if you please remind everyone how they can ask questions.
Will do, Donna. Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who would like to ask an audio question, please press 7# on your telephone now, and you'll be placed in a queue in the order received. Wait for your name to be announced and be prepared to ask your question. Again, 7# to ask an audio question, or continue to send your chat messages.
Okay. Now, there were a few questions that did come through, and not sure that everyone got the full gist of all of the questions. Kathy Barrett asked one on transportation, and it said, on transportation costs, can you simply allocate the total transportation cost to all students transported, or do you need to allocate the cost based on how many days the students were transported over the summer? And Lisa, if you can just reiterate your answer.
The question that was raised really relates to how do you properly allocate for students who are transported for 30 days, and there was a follow-up question if students are transported for less than 30 days. You really want to capture the expenses associated with the period of time that you're transporting the students, particularly in the summer. You know, like for example, if you hire bus drivers and bus aides to work in the summer, you can capture very directly the cost of the salary and benefits for those staff. And if you know how many students you're transporting, you can simply divide it by the number of students you're transporting to come up with a cost per pupil. If you have students that are transported less than the 30 days, then you would simply apply a proration method to allocate that.
Okay, and I think that covers all of the transportation questions that were asked. Certainly a lot of topics were covered here, and I'm sure May 18 will provide a lot of new and different information for districts. What are some things that people should be aware of with these budgets if their budgets don't pass? Is there anything that's affected here?
Not really for state aid. It really depends on what happens when the budget is passed and what they approve as our next state aid package.
Okay.
So we really, as far as maximizing your aid, can't answer that until we know if they're changing things. Are they going to be taking, a larger deduction? Are they going to give it back and then take it mid-year? Those things are going to be hard to answer. I think the easy part to answer is, look now at what would happen if your budget were to go down, what you have to do for contingent budget, what's required of putting it back up for the first vote and whether or not you'll do that. Just be prepared for those types of things now, and we can all hope and pray that we have a budget before it's time to set our tax rates so that we know exactly what we're going to be doing.
Well, today I was at a meeting, and there just doesn't seem to be a clear crystal ball prediction on the New York State budget. Someone was saying they thought that it would be June, and someone said they were hoping we would have a budget by November. So,
well, that's a little frightening.
Yes, isn't it?
I think one of the scary prospects of having a budget, that falls after the point where we set our tax levy is, some districts choose to budget the governor's proposal, some choose to assume some level of restoration. This is probably a dangerous year to do that, or at least too much restoration. But without having that information, you're going into a school year where you're beginning to make expenses and you haven't nailed down your revenue base. So districts are really going to struggle with that, and I would recommend that you have a contingency plan in place so that if the revenues that you are budgeting or have budgeted do not materialize, particularly if you budgeted something beyond the governor's proposal, that you have a backup plan, either through the use of reserves or a plan to reduce your expenditures to fall in line with your revenues that you're going to receive.
Certainly good advice and a good thought process to have in mind. I don't envy any of you the jobs that you have to try and make some sense of all of the nonsense that is going around, and trying to be fair to your students, to your staff, and to the community on what is going to be best and to keep the district solvent. Not an easy year, and the future, sorry to say, doesn't look that promising either. So good for all of you
Right.
to keep sane, keep balanced, and know that you're just doing the best that you possibly can. We at the annual conference and also at the SBMW, both speakers are talking about how to deal with stress, how to keep balanced in life, because we realize the stress that everyone is going through, and people are looking for answers, and gosh, there just don't seem to be any out there.
Not at this point.
Not at this point. You know, I think it's difficult, too, because folks in the community are going through the same stresses. And
yes.
We try to recognize that people that are coming to meetings that are concerned about their taxes or that programs being eliminated, they're managing through a different level of stress.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're dealing with your publics, try to keep that in mind, that, you know, folks are struggling economically. Those folks who have young children in school are concerned about the future of their children's education. So it's difficult to balance because you've got folks on one side of the fence who really care about preserving the educational program, and folks on the other side of the fence who are concerned about their taxes, and then you have folks in the middle who are concerned about both.
Right.
So it's hard to please all those constituencies. So, you know, hang in there and make sure that you take some time for yourself, and I think that's important for business officials now more than ever.
Definitely good advice. Anything else? There doesn't seem to be any questions coming in. I think you did an excellent job. Any just final words of wisdom?
Really, just
The person who would
along. The most important thing with state aid is file on time and file appropriately. So just do the best you can and trust your judgment and ask questions. Rely on your neighbors, rely on your colleagues, and call the state education department when you need an answer.
Okay, thank you. And to me, it's paying attention to detail. Gosh, there's so many details. But you certainly have provided a good handout. Use this as a good reference tool. And I truly thank Sherry and Lisa for all of their good information, the time that they put together, and to our sponsor, Cadeni Architects, and to all of you. And hope you enjoy the rest of this very beautiful day, and look forward to having you participate in our next ASBO webinar or at our next ASBO event. There is still a treasurer's workshop on Friday in the Hornell area if you're interested in getting more information on how to maximize with good accounting. So thank you all for attending, and see you next time.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's New York State ASBO webinar. Thank you again to Cadeni Architects for sponsoring today's webinar, and thank you all for attending.
The moderator has